South Africa forced out its white engineers. It ended in disaster. The grid started failing, the country started going dark, and eventually the government had to do something almost unthinkable. It begged the same engineers back. This is the story of how Africa's most advanced electrical grid collapsed, and how a country that traded competence for ideology ended up sitting in candlelight, drafting recruitment letters to the people that it once forced out. Start with what it actually looked like at the bottom. Johannesburg, evening rush hour. The traffic lights die mid-intersection. Entire suburbs vanish into blackness in the space of a breath. Shops slam their shutters, hospitals scramble onto backup generators, or at least the ones that still have diesel do. ATMs go dark, Wi-Fi towers fail. Refrigerators in millions of homes start their slow, silent thaw. Factories grind to a halt mid-shift, with half-finished products frozen on assembly lines. And across the entire country, ordinary South Africans do something almost unthinkable for the most industrialized nation on the African continent. They light candles. In some neighborhoods, they had to do this for up to 12 hours a day, every day, for weeks at a time. In 2023, the worst year on record, South Africa lost a staggering 24,638 gigawatt hours of electricity to controlled blackouts, what locals call load shedding. Now, for perspective, the country had just lost 192 gigawatt hours to the same problem in 2018. In other words, the crisis got more than 100 times worse in 5 years. At its peak, large parts of the country sat through up to 12 hours of darkness a day under what was called Stage 6 load shedding. The CSIR, the country's premier scientific body, estimated the economic damage at 2.9 trillion rand, roughly 170 billion US dollars, torched in a single year. Cold chains were broken, medical equipment failing, students studying by flashlight, an entire economy stumbling through the dark. And the most haunting part of all of this, none of it happened by accident. It happened because South Africa made a choice. And before we get to the disaster, before we get to how the country had to swallow its pride and crawl back to the very people it pushed away, we need to go back to where Eskom, the national power company, was something the entire African continent, because Eskom was not always a punchline. In the late 1990s, South Africa operated the most advanced electrical grid in Africa, more than 38,000 megawatts of installed capacity, an energy availability factor consistently above 85%, a planning reserve margin north of 20%, meaning that the system always had a healthy cushion between supply and demand. The grid was reliable enough that South Africa exported roughly 1,500 megawatts of electricity every year to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, earning hard currency on long-term contracts that pumped over R1 billion a year into the country's balance of payments. Industrial tariffs sat at about 2.3 US cents per kilowatt hour, roughly 35% below the OECD industrial average. That kind of price predictability is rocket fuel for an industrial economy. Aluminum smelters at Richards Bay and Hillsdale, ferrochrome plants in the Northwest, platinum mines that hauled more than 40% of the world's platinum group metals out of South African rock. All of it ran on Eskom power. Foreign investment prospectus routinely cited the grid's tariff predictability and 99.3% availability factor as a decisive reason to put capital into the country. Behind the lights was a quiet engineering corps of roughly 4,200 registered professionals: mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, plant operators, senior artisans, most with 15 to 30 years of hands-on experience at facilities like Lethabo, Matimba, and Kendal. They knew the grid the way that a heart surgeon knows a heartbeat. Every turbine blade, every transformer, every electrostatic precipitator, logged, tracked, predicted years in advance. The training pipeline ran straight out of the University of Pretoria and the University of Witwatersrand, with curricula built around high-pressure boiler dynamics and live line maintenance protocols. This was a system that worked, a national asset that propped up an entire economy, a power utility ranked in the top tier of global performance benchmarks. Then, politics walked through the door. The transition out of apartheid was supposed to fix a country, and in many ways, it did. But somewhere in the policy machinery, a fateful decision was made. In 1998, the government published a white paper on energy policy that explicitly framed electricity supply as an instrument of, quote, deracialization. Translation: the workforce running the power stations had to be reshaped to match national demographic proportions. Approximately 76.7% Black African, 8.9% colored, 2.6% Indian, and just under 10.9% white. That directive became law through the Employment Equity Act of 1998 and then the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003. By 2004, Eskom's shareholder compact required 60% of all new engineering appointments to come from designated groups. Promotion pathways that traditionally took 15 years were compressed to 7 or 9. Executive bonuses were tied to transformation scorecards rather than plant availability or cost per kilowatt hour. In other words, the people running the power stations were being graded on demographics, not whether the lights stayed on. Then came the exits. Between 1994 and 2002 alone, at least 10,207 white technical professionals left Eskom. From 2000 onward, the utility spent roughly 1.8 billion rand in today's money on voluntary severance and early retirement packages specifically designed to accelerate departures. Inside the organization, the process had a polite, almost antiseptic name. They called it creating space. The trade union Solidarity, which represented many of those leaving, described it more bluntly. Eskom, in their words, had developed a long history of getting rid of the most skilled people. Senior engineers were quietly suspended pending investigations that would drag on for months. Internal postings for critical roles were advertised with racial preferences that narrowed applicant pools before any technical assessment would actually occur. Speaking up was risky. Any public questioning of quota-driven decisions invited formal complaints and an internal label as resistant to transformation. And even as recently as 2017, with the grid already cracking, Eskom's affirmative action plans reportedly made provision to remove another 1,700 engineers and artisans. The Department of Labor's later skills audit captured the scale of what happened. Between 2008 and 2018, the utility lost 47% of its registered professional engineers, almost half, gone in a decade. Solidarity's chief executive, Dirk Herman, put it bluntly in a letter to the minister. Eskom had implemented a transformation program that, in his words, in fact reduced the engineering and technical skills base of the utility. The skill loss came too much too fast, and the country was still paying for that loss of institutional memory years later. Think about what that means in physical terms. The senior technicians who had calibrated coal-fired boilers in the 1980s, who knew which valves rattled at which load, who could hear a bearing fall from across a turbine hull, those people walked out the door. In many cases, they were replaced through accelerated learnership programs that emphasized regulatory compliance and abbreviated technical modules. Handover protocols collapsed under the sheer volume of simultaneous departures. New entrants inherited responsibility for systems whose failure modes required years of pattern recognition to diagnose. And the irony of what came next is going to hit hard in just a moment, because as early as 2019, years before the worst of the load shedding hit, Solidarity had already been quietly building a database of these very engineers, offering to send them back to Eskom. The minister at the time received a list of 705 names: engineers, specialized artisans, skilled operators, 500 years of combined experience. But nothing happened. The list sat in a drawer, and the grid kept slipping. The damage was invisible at first. Power stations kept running, bills got paid, politicians would give speeches about transformation. And inside the boilers and substations and control rooms, a slow, quiet erosion was eating the grid alive. Hey, if you're following along, hit subscribe, because what comes next is where the lights actually start going out across the whole country and how it dramatically gets worse before the reversal lands. Because here's what happens when you remove the people who know how the system works. The system stops being maintained properly. The numbers are brutal. Eskom's internal audit showed that coal plant availability dropped from 85% in 2008 to 68% within roughly a decade. Tube leaks on critical boiler piping rose from around $1,200 per year in 2009 to more than $3,800 per year by 2018. Weld failure rates on high-pressure piping tripled. Maintenance overtime ballooned by 217% between 2012 and 2019. Completion rates for planned outages collapsed below 37%. Average time to repair a high-voltage transmission fault stretched from 14 hours in 2005 to 67 hours by 2020. Translation: Maintenance windows that were supposed to take 10 days began to take 30. Repairs that should have been routine started failing, and the cost of bringing in outside consultants to plug the holes exploded. Specialist contractors were brought in at daily rates exceeding 25,000 Rand per head, paid out while the institutional knowledge that used to live inside of Eskom collected dust in some HR archive. A pattern emerged. A boiler tube leak forced an unscheduled outage. The outage extended because the replacement crew lacked the experience to weld critical high-pressure piping to spec. The unit came back online derated, running below its rated capacity. The remaining units had to pick up the slack, accelerating their own wear, and the cycle continued. By the late 2010s, several baseload stations were functionally inoperable for months at a stretch. Ash handling systems designed for drier coal experienced repeated overflows that corroded downstream equipment. Pulverizers were blocked, conveyors were choked. Multiple 600-megawatt units were derated by up to 30%. By 2007, the country's reserve margin, the cushion between supply and demand, had fallen below 5%. The buffer was gone. The grid was operating on a knife edge, and nobody who was left standing in the building had the authority or the experience to say we have to stop. Then came the corruption that turned a slow decline into a freefall. Because when you take competent people out of decision-making roles, the people left often can't tell good contracts from bad ones. And that vacuum did not stay empty. It got filled by procurement networks that were, in some cases, plainly designed to extract money from a national asset. By 2017, roughly 68% of Eskom's coal supply contracts were going to junior miners with no prior large-scale mining track record, many of them entities with documented ties to politically connected individuals. Between 2010 and 2020, Eskom paid an estimated 142 billion Rand for coal sourced from these smaller operations. Many didn't have rail access, hauling product over crumbling provincial roads in overloaded trucks. The coal that arrived at the power stations was, in technical terms, garbage. Average calorific value collapsed to around 17.4 megajoules per kilogram, compared to the 24 to 26 megajoules per kilogram standard that the system was actually designed for. Moisture content frequently exceeded 28%. That meant blockages in conveyors, flame instability in boilers, sludge accumulation that forced multiple 600-megawatt units to run at as little as 70% of their rated capacity. The grid was literally being damaged by the coal it was burning. A forensic review later identified roughly 23.4 billion Rand in overpayments tied to coal contracts between 2014 and 2019 alone. That's enough money to have rebuilt entire turbine halls, or, and this is the part that should make any taxpayer furious, enough money to have hired back every senior engineer the system had pushed away, many times over. Instead, that money disappeared into a procurement maze that the Zondo Commission later linked to broader patterns of state capture and systematic looting. The commission documented in extensive detail how Eskom had been hollowed out from the inside. Coal contracts steered to politically connected firms, maintenance budgets were gutted to fund patronage networks, executives were appointed by political loyalty rather than technical competence. Gupta-linked companies, later implicated in massive corruption, secured Eskom contracts using exactly the BEE machinery that was supposed to protect public assets. The international markets noticed. Ratings agencies steadily downgraded Eskom's debt below investment grade. Foreign direct investment into energy-intensive sectors collapsed by more than 60% over the worst decade. Capital flight accelerated every time load-shedding stages crossed stage 4. The country's own central bank quietly built grid instability assumptions into its quarterly growth projections because there was no longer a credible scenario where the lights stayed on. By 2023, Eskom had accumulated more than 400 billion Rand in debt and was functionally bankrupt, kept alive only by repeated emergency bailouts from the national treasury. The Zuma years did not create this problem, but they did pour gasoline on a fire that had already been smoldering for a decade. Then came the dark years. In 2008, South Africa had its first sustained nationwide blackouts. By 2014, the pattern had hardened into stage 3 and 4 rotations, meaning thousands of megawatts deliberately cut from the grid at peak hours. By 2022, the country was logging over 11,800 gigawatt hours lost to load shedding in a single year. And then 2023 hit, and the system effectively broke. That year, South Africa lost 24,638 gigawatt hours to deliberate blackouts. For weeks at a time, large parts of the country sat through up to 12 hours of darkness a day. The Reserve Bank itself estimated that load shedding alone subtracted between 1.8 and 2.4 percentage points from quarterly GDP growth. The National Treasury later put the cumulative economic damage from grid instability, going all the way back to the early collapse, above 5 trillion rand in lost output. The bleeding wasn't abstract. The Chamber of Mines reported that gold and platinum operations forfeited 47 billion rand in revenue during 2022 alone, primarily because underground ventilation and pumping systems couldn't run continuously. Automotive assembly plants in the Eastern Cape recorded production declines of 22% year on year. 38,000 fewer vehicles were assembled, and 1,200 supplier firms were shutting their doors. The Small Business Institute documented roughly 47,000 small enterprises failing between 2020 and 2023, many citing refrigeration failures and inability to meet payroll during extended outages. And it hit ordinary households just as hard. Statistics South Africa found that during peak periods in 2022, 84% of urban and para-urban households were experiencing outages averaging 8.7 hours a day. 8.7 per day. Families were spending up to 12% of monthly income on paraffin stoves and portable generators just to keep food from spoiling. The Department of Basic Education estimated more than 2.1 million learners lost roughly 180 instructional hours a year because they could no longer study after dark. Provincial health departments recorded a 22% rise in preventable complications tied to power instability. Chronic patients struggling to refrigerate insulin, nightly oxygen concentrators failing in the dark, rural clinics burning up to 18% of their operating budgets on diesel. And here's the bitter punchline. While ordinary South Africans were lighting candles and watching their refrigerators die, the wealthy were quietly buying their way out of the crisis. By 2024, private rooftop solar capacity surged across upscale suburbs and commercial districts. Anyone who could afford a 150,000 rand solar installation would get their lights back. Everyone else was left with a public grid that was hemorrhaging revenue while tariffs climbed roughly 190% over the decade. South Africans were paying more than ever for a service that worked less than ever. Two countries were quietly emerging inside one. One country had backup power, biometric access, private boreholes, and armed response on speed dial. The other country, they sat in the dark, and every household that disconnected from the public grid took a paying customer out of a system that was supposed to serve everyone. This is the point in the story that the government had to confront the arithmetic of their own policy. And this is where it gets humiliating, because in May 2022, with the grid actively failing in real time, a letter landed on the desk of the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. The letter came from Solidarity, the very trade union that had been openly accusing Eskom for years of pushing out skilled white workers. Solidarity had been quietly building a database of ex-Eskom engineers since 2019. The first time they offered the list, in 2019, they handed over 705 names with more than 500 years of combined experience, and the government did nothing with it. The names just sat in a drawer while the grid kept failing. Year after year, stage after stage, blackout after blackout. But by 2022, the lights were out, and the political will to do nothing had collapsed. On the 14th of July 2022, Gordhan wrote back. He thanked Solidarity for the offer. He listed exactly what Eskom needed: power station engineers, mechanical, electrical, nuclear, system maintenance, plus senior artisans and plant operators for coal and nuclear stations. And he asked, in writing, for the names to be sent so they could be deployed to the power utility immediately. The letter was, by any honest reading, an admission. The skills the country was now urgently demanding were exactly the skills that the country had spent 2 decades pushing away. Solidarity sent the names. The union had whittled the list down from more than 1,000 applicants. The final shortlist was 300 turnaround specialists. Between them, they carried 5,500 years of cumulative experience in the power sector. 14 of them held PhDs in engineering and related fields. They held more than 400 accredited qualifications between them. Several were internationally sought-after project managers. And this is the detail that stings: several of them offered to come back and work for free. Roughly 70% of the specialists on the list were experts in generation, the part of the grid that had been broken hardest. 16% specialized in distribution, 6% in transmission. The remaining few covered the niche corners that nobody else could fix. These weren't just credentialed engineers, these were the people who had built and run the system in the first place. And after years of being shut out, they were lining up to come back and save it. By November 2022, Eskom had launched what it had called a digital skills crowdsourcing portal. Translation, a recruitment system explicitly designed to bypass the demographic vetting that emptied the utility in the first place. Participation rates climbed to roughly 2/3 of engineers who had left Eskom after 2018. The country that spent decades forcing out experienced engineers in the name of transformation, quote unquote, was now quietly, urgently, almost desperately calling them back. And the political backlash was immediate and brutal. Pravin Gordhan was attacked from inside his own African National Congress for daring to take Solidarity's call. One former parliamentary chair publicly accused him of racism for accepting help from, in the critics' words, a conservative all-white trade union. The National Union of Mine Workers issued a separate statement demanding the minister stop interfering with Eskom's internal recruitment. The Department of Public Enterprises had to issue an official clarification insisting that the minister had not approached Solidarity exclusively, but merely had made a general call for, quote, skilled personnel regardless of race. But the document trail, look, it spoke for itself. The grid had broken, the expertise to fix it had been pushed out years earlier, and the country had to crawl back to the very people that had spent 2 decades, in Solidarity's words, dealing with according to racial ideologies. According to Eskom's own internal performance metrics, each rehired veteran engineer restored an average of roughly 180 megawatts of dependable capacity within 9 months of returning. That is not a small number. That's the equivalent of a small power station recovered unit by unit by the people the system had once paid to leave. Pravin Gordhan had announced his retirement from active politics in March 2024. He died in September the same year, age 75, after a battle with cancer. The Eskom Rehire Program and the broader generation recovery plan launched alongside it outlived him. Which brings us to what happened next, and honestly, it's the part of the story that almost nobody outside of South Africa has heard. Because as of May 15, 2026, Eskom officially marked 1 full year without a single hour of load shedding. The last rotational blackout was implemented on May 15, 2025. After that, the lights stayed on for 365 straight days. The last time that South Africa managed that was September 2018. Diesel costs at Eskom have dropped 84% year on year. The energy availability factor climbed from a humiliating low of 56% in late 2024 to roughly 67% in early 2026. System availability is now reported at about 98.9%. Eskom board chair Mateto Niati publicly credited the recovery to the utility's deep technical and institutional capability built over decades, which is a polite way of saying that the experienced engineers and operators who knew the system were central to getting it working again. Niati also said that the turnaround had been 3 years in the making since the launch of the Generation Recovery Plan. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced earlier in 2026 that the country had, quote, put load shedding behind us. The lights came back on because so did the engineers. And that's the part of the story that the title was pointing toward all along. South Africa forced out its white engineers, and it ended in disaster. And then, very quietly, after begging them back, the grid stabilized. But before anyone starts cheering, there is a catch. Look, the recovery is real, but the underlying problems certainly are not gone. Cable theft and illegal connections continue to bleed roughly 17.5 billion rand a year out of Eskom's revenue. That's about 12% of total generated electricity simply disappearing into informal networks. Even with load shedding suspended, parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal still operate under what Eskom calls load reduction, localized rolling cuts in suburbs where infrastructure has been overloaded by years of theft and deferred maintenance. The grid is breathing again, but it's not yet healthy, and about 9.5 gigawatts of older coal capacity is scheduled to retire by 2030. Meaning that South Africa has now roughly 4 years to replace nearly a quarter of its baseload, or this whole story risks rerunning. And the underlying policy that caused the collapse, however, is still firmly in place. In May 2026, the Democratic Alliance, the second largest party in the current government of national unity, formally tabled the Economic Inclusion for All bill in Parliament, an explicit attempt to replace black economic empowerment with a non-racial framework. President Ramaphosa has, in turn, doubled down on BEE, with new employment equity targets across 18 sectors locked in for a 2030 deadline. Companies with more than 50 employees still have to file 5-year racial workforce plans or face fines. Even within the ANC itself, some senior figures have begun publicly admitting that BEE has been captured by a politically connected elite, but the party refuses to scrap it. In other words, the country saved the grid, but it has not yet decided whether to save the broader system that nearly killed it. And this is the lesson that reaches far beyond South Africa. Complex systems, look, they don't run on politics. They run on competence. You cannot replace decades of operational pattern recognition, the ability to hear a turbine fail before it breaks, to read a transformer oil sample before it ignites, with accelerated training and a demographic checklist. The International Monetary Fund examined 27 emerging economies that embedded racial or ethnic allocation rules into their state-owned utilities. It found a median 11.4% drop in system availability over a 10-year window. Same playbook, same outcome, independent of how much capital was being thrown at the problem. Venezuela learned this when the PDVSA oil company replaced its petroleum engineers along political lines after 1999. Production reliability collapsed despite vast reserves. Zimbabwe learned it when its agricultural parastatals were reshaped after the 2000 land reallocations. Outputs cratered across the board. South Africa has just learned it on the largest national grid in Africa. The pattern is identical because the mechanism is identical. Subordinate technical mastery to political loyalty for long enough, and eventually the physical infrastructure will start to break. Not because anyone wanted it to, but because complex machinery doesn't care about ideology. A pulverizer doesn't care which demographic certified it. A transformer doesn't check the politics of the technician reading its oil. The system simply runs on the people who know it, or it stops running at all. And once the institutional knowledge is gone, the corruption naturally follows. Oversight requires the very technical literacy that gets reduced. Eskom's own forensic audits documented procurement irregularities totaling roughly 15.6 billion rand between 2015 and 2021 alone, concentrated in contracts awarded with minimal engineering due diligence under accelerated transformation criteria. South Africa is, in some ways, the most honest case study in the world. It's a country with deep mineral wealth, sophisticated capital markets, world-class universities, and a free press. The problem was never resources. The problem was the decision to treat engineering competence as a secondary variable for almost 3 decades. And the cost of that decision, by the country's own national treasury estimate, is now north of 5 trillion rand in lost economic output. Tens of thousands of small businesses gone. Hundreds of thousands of jobs vaporized. Public debt above 75% of GDP. Foreign direct investment into energy-intensive sectors is down by more than half across the worst decade. Youth unemployment locked above 50%, meaning more than half of South Africans aged 15 to 24 cannot find work in the economy that the policy was supposed to lift. That is the bill for one experiment in subordinating competence to ideology inside a single state-owned utility. One country, one grid, one generation of pushed-out talent. And the recovery only began once the policy was, in practice, if not on paper, partially reversed. The grid is back. The engineers are back, but the country that fired them is still arguing about whether the next batch of complex systems, water, rail, healthcare, ports, should be staffed by the most experienced people available, or should they just be staffed by the most politically convenient. South African freight rail already collapsed by 34% since 2018. Wastewater treatment is in critical condition across 64% of municipal facilities. The same pattern that brought down the grid is quietly working through every other piece of national infrastructure. So what do you think? Did South Africa just rescue itself, or did it merely buy time just before the next critical system breaks the same way? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this breakdown sharpened the picture for you, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We don't wait for the headlines to catch up. We explain the collapse before the rest of the world even notices it's happening.